And welcome to our talk, our conversation on the role of entrepreneurship in addressing the climate crisis. I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Nicky Dee.
Hello.
And we're going to, over about 40 minutes, talk through the project that we've got underway to use entrepreneurship to address the climate crisis. Why we've done that and so on. We'll leave 20 minutes or so for questions at the end. I've been asked to clarify that there are, it's deliberate that you can't see any slides, and there's no, there will be one slide at the end, but it's not a lecture. It's a conversation. So it's our belief that entrepreneurship can and indeed must be used as part of the solution to the climate crisis has led Nicky and myself and two others to found Carbon 13, which is a Cambridge-based venture builder for the climate emergency. And we'll be sharing some details of what it is and how it works. We will be welcoming our first cohort of entrepreneurs, of founders, in March 2021. We started a teaser program on Tuesday of this week, and we have 23 founders engaged in that program, some quite extraordinary people working on some quite extraordinary ideas to address the challenge of reducing carbon emissions. So, Garth, you've dropped an important question into the chat right away. I think we'll come onto it in the Q&A if that's all right.
Well, it's probably an interesting starting point, Chris, because I know
Thanks, Garth.
Historically this hasn't been your area of focus, but you have you're now dedicating a huge amount of time and energy to the climate emergency. So what prompted that?
Yes, well, I was an entrepreneur as a younger man, a much younger man. But for the last 15 years, I've been teaching and researching entrepreneurship, mostly at University College London. But 4 years ago, I joined the faculty at the Judge. And it was my observation that climate change is simultaneously, and this is rather obvious things to say these days, simultaneously the most serious existential problem that humanity faces. And consequently, because it's such a big problem, it is also a very significant opportunity for innovation and entrepreneurship. I think we all have an idea that the world is decarbonizing its economy. And that's true to an extent, right? That we can think about the transition to renewables and what's happening in terms of electrification, and we can say all that. But we also know that, firstly, the decarbonization isn't happening nearly quickly enough. In 2018, we reduced carbon emissions by about 2%. To have some kind of chance of keeping a normal climate, we think we need to reduce it about 11% a year. So that gap of 9% is pretty serious. And frankly, even the scientists that I follow on this are saying that even if all of the current trajectories in terms of transition to renewables and better batteries and this sort of thing, even if all of those reach their potential, we still won't have decarbonized fast enough. So we need innovation to start new trajectories. Now, there's a particular aspect of the climate change innovation challenge that is particularly suitable to startups, to ventures, to entrepreneurs. And that is that it's not only bringing out new products or new value propositions or new solutions that are lower carbon intensity than the old way of doing things. We need some really systemic change. And the history of innovation tells us that systemic change driving innovations do not come from corporates, right? There are 4 types of innovation that really we need startups for, and we need entrepreneurs for if we want to see them, right? So, and I'll just quickly run through what those are. Firstly, business model innovation. Business model innovation, it's not that corporates are completely incapable of business model innovation, but any business model innovation that cannibalizes their existing revenue or profit streams, they won't touch. Or in fact, they'll play with it because they'll see the writing on the wall in the future, but they won't fully commit to it. So historically, business model innovation that contradicts the dominant logic of existing business models has to come from entrepreneurs. It's created by entrepreneurs and then sold back into the corporate sector, if you like. Secondly, cross-disciplinary innovation, right? Why do we have fintech entrepreneurs? We have fintech entrepreneurs because fundamentally bankers can't, and banks and financial services institutions cannot get their minds around what digital technology means. So fintech entrepreneurs exist to hybridize financial services and digital and teach the financial services sector how to take advantage of that. So we could say that in the same way that profits and revenue streams create an inertia and stickiness, the mindset and sort of what made a corporate successful in the first place makes it very difficult for them to hybridize new ideas into the mix. So entrepreneurs are needed for that. Thirdly, we can see that there's regulatory change coming. I suspect change to the tax regime and so on. Corporates have got public affairs teams doing foresight work, figuring out what the implications of these regulatory changes might be. And that's enlisting some change from them, but what they don't do is they don't use that to make positive investment cases, right? They don't say, the regulations are going to change, we'd better start investing now. They say, the regulations are going to change, let's wait, let's negotiate those regulations and let's see what they look like, and then we'll start investing. Entrepreneurs don't do that. Entrepreneurs are willing to get going on building a better way of doing things before the regulations have even been promulgated, let alone finalized, the ink dry, this sort of thing. Finally, we know that innovation that's predicated on customer behavior change tends to come from entrepreneurs, right? So if you look at a company I find very interesting, Impossible Foods, right? So Impossible Foods brought out the Impossible Burger. The Stanford team that set up Impossible Foods from the start said, the purpose of our business is to have fewer cattle on the planet because cattle are a huge problem for the climate. And their thinking was, we're not going after a small slice of the vegan market or the vegetarian market. We want to make our product mainstream, right? We want to change behavior in the mainstream, in the mass market. So their product development strategy, their marketing strategy, everything was oriented to getting it into the mass market rather than fighting it out with other meat substitute products. Now, that innovation could not have come from the existing food giants, because the existing food giants would have maybe thought of the innovation and made a business case for it, and that business case would have looked at what's the vegetarian market looking like? Growing but small.
Well, and then they go out to their market and the mainstream market and say, what do you think? And they go, oh, this is new, I'm not sure about this.
Exactly. So an entrepreneur is willing to sort of put up with the priming work that's necessary to get those behavior changes rolling. Now, I finally, and thank you for that heads up, Andrew, in the chat. Finally, it's important to note that there's a sort of Silicon Valley model of entrepreneurship that's out there, which is disruption is the key word, if you like, and I don't have anything against disruption. And if you follow the logic of what I've been saying about the types of innovation we need, some of that is disruptive. But we're not, climate change entrepreneurs have to make an interesting choice at the beginning of near the beginning of their journey. Are they going to say, well, my fundamental starting point is bring a value proposition to market that is less carbon intensive, and then than the existing solutions, and then we'll build from there? Or are they going to look at the ecosystem, look across the value chain, look at the whole life cycle of the way that the different contributors to greenhouse gas emissions interact with each other, and try to do something that's fundamentally an ecosystem shaper, an ecosystem disruptor? That's a more complicated problem in a sense than often Silicon Valley startups and investors are willing to take on. And it's actually something that the kinds of businesses that we've seen come out over the last recent decades from Cambridge are willing to take on, right? So we're basing our work in Cambridge, partly because we're Cambridge based ourselves, but also because it's the right place to see these kind of systemic ecosystem driven innovations as well.
And that relates to one of the questions we've had come in actually, which says, the UK can't do it alone. Surely we export most of our carbon emissions to other countries. And that's exactly this point. Yeah. If you take a very localized, narrow view of the problem, then you will often end up with unanticipated consequences. So we are at Carbon 13 very passionate about delivering carbon mitigation to the planet, and not just locally.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question you asked me was, why did I decide to shift focus to this? Well, I hope I've given some sense of the opportunity. Obviously, it's a very urgent problem. We don't have to, Greta Thunberg was popped up three or 4 weeks ago again saying we've wasted the last 2 years, which is the 2 years since she became a public figure. And in many ways, she's right. There are a few positive things in terms of the net zero pledges that are being made by corporates, and that's a precondition for successful entrepreneurship, is that you have these corporates out there saying, we'd better work towards net zero. But partly as in the process of building Carbon 13 over the last year and a half, I've had a lot of conversations with corporates where they've expressed some doubt about how fully fleshed out their net zero plan is, and they're actually crying out for value propositions, business models, new approaches that enable them to do what they've got to do, make revenue, cut costs, while also moving towards the net zero the net zero mission. I've been running entrepreneurship programs for a long time. And I've found it frustrating in the past. I had a wonderful student, very fond of this student, but he set up a business which was arbitraging the different prices that you can get for luxury watches at different airports around the world. And you could use this app to get someone to get that luxury watch £10,000 cheaper and get someone to fly it to you. This is not what the world needs right now. What we need is entrepreneurship that's devoted to allowing this planet to remain habitable, allowing our children and grandchildren to have some kind of future. We talk about this 1.5 degree heating target as if that's a sort of safe zone. If we think about the fires that are going on around the world right now, well, that's before we've even reached what the 1.5 degree target that people talk about as a safe zone. And I know very few scientists who actually think we're really going to achieve 1.5 degrees. The situation is going to get much worse. So one of the sayings that's common in the entrepreneurship world, I don't think Nick is too keen on it, is entrepreneurs need to live in the future and figure out what's missing. Well, we live in the future. What's missing is a set of innovations that allow us to have some semblance of life as we know it.
I guess the reason I'm not keen on that is I've been in this space for far too long, and one of my frustrations is progress has been far too slow. I mean, I remember being at school, which feels like a long time ago now, and having someone come in and talk about the climate crisis, and Yeah, so for me, this feels like a past problem that we've been slow to address. But, you know, this kind of change, unfortunately, does take time, because it's not just about a technical fix. As you said, it's also about changing behavior, changing the infrastructure, changing social norms, which is often what comes when you're talking about the more disruptive change. And the other intriguing aspect is it often shifts the power balance between companies that are doing well, companies that aren't doing so well, and sometimes even countries. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's something really important about this changing social norms. You know, entrepreneurship is an existing vector that we have for change, right? I mean, I have great sympathy for Extinction Rebellion, and I follow the logic of what they're doing entirely. However, I disagree that we have the time to change politics and capitalism utterly. We do have some existing ways of changing social norms and behaviors and the way that we interact with each other in the economy. And one of those is entrepreneurship. So Carbon 13 is predicated on the idea of let's make use of existing social institutions rather than sort of wishing that they were somehow different than they really are.
Yeah. So it's probably worth at this point just telling people exactly what Carbon 13 is. Shall I start?
Yeah, dive in.
Yeah. So the idea is basically a talent first accelerator. So we are going to be bringing 50 people into an 8-month program. And those people are going to be motivated by the desire to solve the climate emergency, but through entrepreneurship. And the goal for Carbon 13 is we're going to have multiple cohorts. So we aim to empower around 1,000 entrepreneurs by 2025 and reduce, well, we've got different figures around this, and we should go into this in a bit more detail, but collectively reduce carbon emissions by 400 million tonnes, which is around the same amount of carbon that's being emitted by the UK at the moment, or alternatively think about it as 1% of global emissions.
Yeah. And that loops back again to this penetrating question that you asked about our export of our carbon emissions to other countries, right? So these are starting global. These 50 founders are aiming to create globally ambitious companies that are seeking to reshape entire industries across national boundaries, not just sort of local initiatives, if you like. Yeah, as Nicky said, 1,000 entrepreneurs over the next 5 years. There are other talent first accelerators out there that have sort of developed this model of bringing together technical people, scientists, engineers, computer scientists with commercial people, serial entrepreneurs, industry experienced folks, and trying to form dream teams and get those dream teams going faster than is otherwise possible. And these programs have got some fascinating results in terms of shortening the length of time that it takes to get from sort of gleam in some founder's eye stage to actually raising what we call in the venture world the Series A round, that allows them to really start scaling at a quite significant rate. So the talent first model is partly aligned with the need for urgency, right? The other thing the talent first model is aligned with is the need for originality, right? So if you think about what happens when an early stage founder is sort of has an idea that they think is worth investigating. They go around and they get a lot of advice. I can tell you from much experience advising these folks that a lot of the advice that they get is, you know, it would be more sellable to investors if you did it a bit more like that company that just got funded over there, right? And that's, you know, almost anyone can give that advice, right? All you need to do is track what types of deals are happening and what investments are being made in the startup world. And then you are fully qualified to give the advice to all early stage entrepreneurs. Do it more like that guy who just got funded. Well, what I've heard from so many corporate venture capitalists, so many corporates who are looking for net zero innovations, is that all the ideas out there are pretty much the same, right? And they're very concerned that they're not seeing enough originality. In a talent first accelerator like Carbon 13, we, the core team and our advisors, are in a position to say, hey, wait a second, don't shave the originality out of your model too quickly, because it's the originality that gives it the chance of standing out in the market, right? So, I mean, of course, every business and every early stage venture has to balance sort of looking familiar to the world and sort of, oh, I can recognize what that's trying to do, with the crazy change that they want to bring. But what we've seen with other talent first accelerators, and what we certainly aim to do ourselves, is that there's an opportunity that to get them going on a fast trajectory without shaving out that level of originality.
So we've had a question from Mayang who says, can you give us some recent examples of Cambridge climate startups, of the sorts of ideas, challenges that we're hoping future cohorts will tackle? So maybe if I take that one to give a bit more flesh on the bones. So if we look at the targets that we're trying to hit, we are looking at ambitious ventures, so very much scalable ventures that can reach a goal of mitigating 10 million tons of carbon each year. And you might well say to me, I don't really understand what that means, which is perfectly fine. If you break that down, I know Chris could talk through the Impossible Burger example in a minute. Each of us in the developed world, if you take sort of a rule of thumb and say we emit 10,000 tons of CO2 per year, it's actually higher for North Americans, it's slightly lower for some European countries, then you can see that what you're hoping to do is either remove carbon entirely, i.e. allow 1 million people to go net zero, or otherwise you can help 10 million people remove just a small fraction, 10%. So what are the kinds of technologies that we're looking at? When we look at, we can see now why it is that we're looking at the more radical end of entrepreneurship. So I could run through, there's an eco village up in Findhorn where they really strive to put renewable energy, try to use their own allotments to grow vegetables, try to remove cars, and they've had a real problem with reducing their carbon emissions. And part of it, ironically, is that people want to come and visit and see what they're doing. So when they factor in not just their own carbon emissions, but also the carbon emissions of people visiting them, they've had actually very little impact. Which is a worrying thing, because at the moment people think, oh, isn't this quite easy? We just decarbonize the grid, we electrify heat, we get some electric vehicles, and then we've done it. And we haven't. And that's where we need to really start thinking of some of these more interesting solutions. So yes, energy efficiency is part of it, getting cleaner energy is part of it, but carbon is in absolutely everything that we do. And to give an idea of, we're not just talking about behaviour change. I've worked in this field for a long time, and I've had the privilege of working in the Unilever Awards, where we work with entrepreneurs around the world in broadly the field of sustainability. And just to pick one of the entrepreneurs, Elizabeth, she came across a probiotic that you add to cattle feed. And this is something that corporates have been investing a huge amount of money in. How do we reduce methane emissions from cattle? Massive problem globally. Of course, ideally, we stop eating meat, but there are still going to be cattle. And this particular probiotic overcomes several problems. It's really palatable. Many of the other feed additives are really not very nice to taste for the cattle. It's actually really cheap to produce, and the big headline is that introducing this ingredient to 1% of US cattle is the equivalent of removing 1 million cars from the roads. And this is someone who's done a PhD, come out and is really passionate about disseminating this solution around the world. But what she's lacked is a great team around her, and of course that's on those entrepreneurial insights that you can get hopefully from a program like ours. So we want to accelerate ideas like hers and really get them out and making an impact. Someone with less resource than a corporate who's nonetheless got a brilliant idea. Also worked with, obviously plastics has been a huge issue. We know that consumers are really alert to that, and plastics again, big carbon footprint. Ironically, during coronavirus, we've gone backwards because single-use plastics have increased. But there are some really interesting things that we're looking at in that space. And that is where that combination of technical and behavioural changes is really critical. So if you look at what happens ends of life, you can have closed loop recycling systems, you can change the open loop recycling, you can change the material that you're using, there's all sorts of things. And again, that's where we're seeing entrepreneurs come up with some really interesting solutions. So those are just a couple of things.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Nicky. There are a couple of really inspiring and stimulating pieces of work that have been done at the macro scale. I mean, I think just commenting on Nicky's stories there, I think what you see when you've been working with early stage entrepreneurs for a long time is that something that looks fairly trivial and nothingy at the beginning, if it has a real impact on a sort of a unit scale, a micro scale, can be scaled up. It does require the right sort of shepherding through the innovation system, right? And that's what we're here to foster. If you have a look, many of you who've joined us may be familiar with Project Drawdown, which is an inspiring sort of tour through lots of different problem areas and potential solution areas that have the potential to really make a difference. There's also a somewhat similar body called Mission Innovation, which is trying to assemble a list of potential solutions that could bring the whole planet to net zero if these solutions were commercialized and brought to and brought to readiness. I think Richard Topham has asked a very interesting question in the Q&A. He said, we've recently achieved significant emissions reduction, but we needed COVID to do so. Is that a cost the population is willing to bear? So I think we have a mental model that's inherent in your question, Richard, which is that people are going to have to change because they're forced to. Right? That there's going to be a sort of, there's going to have to be a lot of suffering involved in the transitions that we're talking about having to make. And I won't dispute that completely. I think there will have to be some taxes, if you can call that suffering. There will have to be some policy changes that drive behavior in certain directions. But one of the ways in which entrepreneurship has achieves its legitimacy in human affairs is that fundamentally it's about figuring out changes that people are willing and would like to make because they're trading off something that they want for something for the old way of doing things, right? If we think about the transition, and it's a rather well-used example, but if we think about the transition from CDs to MP3s, it took quite a number of years, took more than 5 years from the introduction of the MP3 technology to the point where people were really en masse giving up their CD collections and going and going to MP3s. Now, those people were giving something up, right? They were, I remember the pain of my, losing my beautifully catalogued CD collection and the sort of the unhappiness that caused me. But I was willing to do it because there was a better solution on the horizon. And so when we think about consumer changes, that's part of what we're talking about. When we think about enterprise changes, it's a little easier, right? Because enterprises, corporates in particular, who have made these net zero pledges, are going to be evaluating the changes that are required with a fairly utilitarian approach, saying, well, we've got to find ways to cut our costs and increase our revenues while also reducing our carbon intensity. If you bring us something like that, we'll have a look at it. We'll engage. It's very hard for any of us in this room, if I can call it a room, to picture what the post adaptation world is going to look like. We could throw our sort of futurist, we could put our futurist hats on and say, oh, it's going, probably there'll be some element of this and there'll be some element of that. But the world we're going to live in is going to be created partly, not only, but partly by entrepreneurs figuring out how to make the changes that we need to make palatable, how to make them something that people actually are happy to and want to adopt.
We do need a just transition. I mean, I think, so there've been some quite interesting numbers going about the amount of, obviously, emissions that have been reduced because of people basically stopping movement in COVID-19. And I don't think that it's a cost that we can afford to bear for many, many years. And that is actually why we do need entrepreneurship, not just entrepreneurship for the climate crisis, but also entrepreneurship for COVID-19, which is what we are seeing, because we need creative destruction. We need the creative side of it. Entrepreneurship and startups remain the main source of job creation in an economy. So without it, we really are creating some problems. And I think timing is absolutely critical. The sooner we start doing it, the better. But as ever, I think entrepreneurship, if you do things too early, you can also end up in trouble. So maybe a good question is, why now? You heard me say I've been a little bit frustrated, but I have never seen governments respond in the way that they have to climate change as an issue, and start advocating and introducing policies for net zero. Corporates, as Chris said earlier, it is quite remarkable to me that we have seen corporates sign up to net zero, and when you say to them, how are you going to do that? They say, yeah, we don't know. That is really unusual. Usually they will only sign up to things that they know how to deliver. And of course, the third part of it is consumers. And I think consumer awareness of the problems that we have in the sustainability field overall are greater than they've ever been. Admittedly, there is a laggard in the world, in the US, and I know someone's mentioned that. What happens if the US falls out of the Paris Agreement? Well, I think the rest of the world, what's so interesting to me is that once people would have seen that as a real risk and said, if the US goes, China goes, then Europe goes, and then the whole thing will fall apart. But instead, it has just increased the resolve around the world, and everyone's gone, okay, if you want to do that over there, that's fine, but we recognize this issue is so important that we're going to stick with the Paris agreements. We expect at some point we will be innovating in this field, and then the US, when they come back in and see what's going on, they're going to need to buy from us. So that is quite unprecedented, I think.
I mean, to give a very concrete example, Denmark's economy has hugely benefited from their willingness to foster the wind energy industry, and so if you, and this is the difference between entrepreneurship and sort of corporate innovation, is you look at the potential market not in terms of, well, what's the existing potential market, who's going to buy today, but in terms of the vectors that you have for going along. I mean, I find as an American, I don't know if you picked up my accent, I've lived in the UK for 30 years, but I am an American. I find the current situation hugely frustrating, as we all do, but entrepreneurial creation of innovations is something that we can get on with, and which will then be ready for the Americans to buy when they come to their senses, is one way of thinking about it, right? If you think about the destruction of not just the natural world, but the sort of human inhabited part of the world that's going on right now across the country, it's hard to believe that they're going to remain quite so blasé about the situation for very much longer. Nicky, I think we've had some really stimulating questions. So shall we dive in? Shall we spend the rest of the session trying to respond to some of these questions, or do
We're not good at sticking to a script, are we?
Shall we stick to our script, or what? You know,
no. Well, I was just looking at one. Someone is asking about disruptive technologies like blockchain and AI. Is it part of the carbon reduction narrative? Even though they are also using energy. And actually, the reason I wanted to pick up on that in particular is there's been a recent study in Nature looking at AI and whether it is positive or negative in terms of the SDGs. So breaking that down: environment, society, and economy. And overwhelmingly, the answer is yes, positive. So 71% compared to 23%. And I know practically I've been seeing these kinds of technologies. There is a lot of hype, it has to be said. And I know that there are some
natural feature of all technologies.
Exactly. In the innovation space, we love a buzzword. We like to, anyway. So yeah, I think everyone has become a lot more cautious, but you're right. And it's not just blockchain and AI, it's also IoT. We're seeing sensors, and one of the innovation opportunities with sensors is doing things like energy harvesting. So I've got wireless radiator thermostats, so I can do zoning in my house as an example, but they use batteries. There are companies who've been exploring energy harvesting, so you don't need to use the batteries. And that's not just for radiator thermostats, that's also in industrial plants and elsewhere. So we're getting much smarter about how we deal with these problems. And that's the point. If you do a systems analysis and you look at carbon as well as the commercials and everything else, then you can hopefully produce some really neat solutions. So that's one of the questions. I don't know if one of the questions is...
So I'm looking at David Linus's question, which is building really on what Richard Topham's question about COVID and the implications of COVID. So I think what we're seeing is so really interesting changes around commuting, obviously, right? Possibly offset by, well, what are people doing with that time? Are they doing carbon neutral things with that time, or are they doing carbon generating things with the time that they're that they're getting back? And that's an open question. It's certainly the case that the balls are up in the air in terms of behavior change, right? That the sort of some of the things that we take for granted around the way that people divide their time between spending time in the office, commuting, and social time could potentially be shifting. And that's what entrepreneurs like. Entrepreneurs like a zone of uncertainty where they are able to dive in and try to experiment and see whether some configuration of elements of value that they bring out to the customer turns out to resonate with people and get some buzz going and start to diffuse through society. The more uncertainty, the less attractive it is, frankly, to incumbent marketers who think, oh, I want to spend my budget in a way that's going to generate a predictable return. And that actually creates more opportunities for entrepreneurs to sort of get in the cracks and say, okay, well, people's behavior has shifted in this way. Let's see if we can turn that to the climate's advantage.
Just building on that, Chris, I've noticed, again, from someone anonymous saying, is the internet actually streaming a solution which is powered by fossil fuels? Maybe it's useful to say, so some of the big winners during coronavirus, we're on one of them right now, TikTok. So some of these streaming services have been doing really well, but there is no reason why we can't have clean energy powering the internet. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with low carbon, decarbonizing electricity and the need for smart energy. I did have this argument. I've had this argument a few times in the last decade. Can we have a grid that is 100% renewables based? And the answer is yes, we can, but we have to do it in a smart way. So I don't think having the internet necessarily means we are locked into a dirty path forward. Yeah. And then just switching, Robert Benstead-Smith, you brought up something that's been a really hot topic recently. Soil is a huge carbon store and soil erosion a source of emissions. Are there any game changers on the horizon there? Absolutely. And this is, again, an interesting link to COVID-19 or possibly Brexit, dare I say that word. So regenerative farming. To date, you might not have heard that term very, very much, but I think you will start hearing it more. And that addresses exactly the issue you've talked about. It also tends to be more labour intensive, so there is an opportunity for employment. But regenerative farming, at the moment, for those of you who are in the UK, you can see many of the fields have been stripped completely. They've been harvested and there's bare soil. And you can literally see the soil being blown away from the top of the field. So you can see it with your very eyes. And there are some really alarming stats around it. There are some films at the moment about it. But yes, there is innovation in that space as well.
And the next question coming through is looking at another aspect of the issue, which is that even with the current level of global heating, we're seeing massive refugee flows. And I read a paper last week suggesting that even in mild conservative scenarios, we'll see double the level of refugees that have ever, double the current level and double the 500 million refugees looks like, as opposed to the current 250 million around the world, looks like a conservative scenario. So Carbon 13's focus is on mitigating climate change by addressing carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial opportunity in the adaptation challenge, right? We've gone too far for this not to really fundamentally change the nature of life on Earth. And of course,
we had that debate, didn't we, Chris?
Yeah, we're very early on.
We were saying, what are we going to do? Are we going to do both? Yeah. And we sort of decided initially, let's focus on mitigation, whilst also being aware that where possible, we should help adaptation, and maybe in the future we could do some more of that.
And the two trends intersect, right? Because actually, if Nicky, you referenced the just transition, right? If societies are finding ways to deal with this, the situation of increased refugee flows in a way that makes carbon emissions worse, then we've got a serious problem that needs to be planned for. It needs to be thought. Business solutions need to be developed, and economic life situations need to be developed that are going to allow refugees to integrate into their new homes in ways that don't drive up emissions. Putting my sort of entrepreneurship research hat on, something that I'm always fascinated by when I think about refugee flows is we have a lot of evidence that immigrants in general, including refugees, and we have someone who's a refugee on our carbon 13 teaser programs that we're running right now, are statistically far more likely to be entrepreneurs than someone who grew up in the country that they're still living in. And there's it's parallel to carbon 13's main mission, but I think there's a very interesting aspect of what's going on there, which is people with different perspectives, people with different mindsets are fundamental to innovation, right? And integrating integrating all different perspectives and mindset into what you want to do is actually, we know from all the analysis that's taken place by academia over the last decades, is fundamental to doing game-changing breakthrough type innovation.
Shall I take another question, Chris?
Go for it.
So, Mayank, you're talking about the VC ecosystem. I'm going to go through this super quick, and happy to have follow-up questions after this. Is the VC model appropriate? Probably not. I think we know that there are some deep flaws in the VC system, but it is the one that we've got right now, and we do think that there are opportunities to engage with that. The UK has actually been quite pioneering in something called patient capital. So if you are interested in that space, have a look. There are fewer climate-focused VC firms in Europe. Yes and no. We are seeing that increase, and besides, we're not talking about sacrificing the financial returns. We think that you need to have an economic system which engages with doing good, and we're seeing increases in the impact investment space and also the sort of clean tech finance space. But yes, as you say, that industry was burnt, and we could have a much longer conversation about that. But it's also quite a typical thing. You'll probably remember the dot-com bubble. You frequently, in areas of innovation, you'll see a bit of a Gartner hype cycle. I don't know if you've heard of that, which is where you get a lot of hype and excitement. Things get overvalued. You don't really understand where the value is coming from, and then that value doesn't seem to hold. People get very disillusioned and frustrated. All the money gets pulled out, valuations decline. The ventures who are really onto something work hard, start to understand the business model, the space, where the commercial opportunities are, and then those valuations climb up higher than they were originally. So the question is if that clean tech 1.0 bubble, if we call it that, if that was just inevitable part of the system sort of figuring out how to make this stuff work, and we're actually climbing back up again. So that's one thought on that.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that, Nicky, that look, the VC industry as we know it arose and is perpetuated and driven by integrating the internet into the world economic system, right? So if you think about the internet as a general purpose technology, when steam engines came along, it was necessary the world came up with a financing system that allowed steam power to be integrated into the world's economy. When the internet came along, a new, building on some existing institutions, as always happens, building on some existing institutions that just happen to be based in California, the internet venture capital industry took off like a rocket. The way to look at this respectfully is to come back to the gap between the 2% decarbonization and the 11% decarbonization, right? That is a very, you know, we're not approaching this, and I'm not suggesting that anybody should be approaching it from the point of view of saying, wouldn't it be a good thing if we, wouldn't it be a really positive social action if we closed that gap? I'm saying we will not survive on this planet if we don't close that gap, right? So that's a different kind, you know, if we say, well, if we came before you and said, oh, we've got an innovation engine that's going to try to solve poverty, right? Well, that would be a very worthwhile thing to do. But frankly, poverty is a political problem, not an innovation problem, right? Climate change is susceptible, not completely, but it's susceptible to some of the methods of innovation. So just like climate change is going to reshape every other industry on this globe, climate change is going to reshape the VC industry, because the VC industry is going to have to go where the returns are, and the returns are going to be in helping keep the planet alive, right? On the one hand, yes, the flaws are really evident in the existing models. On the other hand, the models will change because society needs them to, right? Not because we ask them nicely because it would really be a lovely thing for the planet, but because we won't survive if we don't.
Chris, I'm going to do a very quick rattle through on some of the questions and then leave you to answer one about how people sort of get involved with what we're up to.
Yeah, great.
So Anita, a lot of focus on new technologies. We had this debate too, but we've decided that we are tech enabled. Because you're absolutely right. Some of the solutions we have, but what we haven't figured out is the model to really get wide scale up. And yes, the 1% for the cattle was just an example of the amount of impact that could be had. The trick is, how do you get that probiotic into every feed of cattle around the world, which is a very intriguing problem from a business perspective, actually. New bike lanes. I mean, bikes are one of the best sort of climate positive technologies that we have, and it's a great example because we're not talking about something radical, we're talking about something that we've already got, but in order to use them more, we do need to look at perhaps the infrastructure around us. And then electric charging points. I mean, there's been a huge wave of entrepreneurial activity in this space, and there's more continuing on because electric vehicles have a critical part in allowing us to bring renewables, which are intermittent, into the grid, and having a smart grid. So they're a really key part of the solution. And I don't entirely agree with Chris's point that entrepreneurship can't help poverty. I know you're being, but I think
it hasn't helped so far.
Anyway, and then there's a comment here where is it Andrew? You say we're already going to, we cannot stop climate change. We can only minimize it. Mustn't adaptation, innovation, especially. Yes, I mean, absolutely, we do. So we do, and it's really urgent to look at adaptation. There are some super interesting entrepreneurial solutions there, and I've been working with entrepreneurs in this space. But Carbon 13 at this point in time is focused on mitigation, because we think that is the urgent piece of the puzzle. We need to mitigate against the need for adaptation. So the big question for you, Chris, again from my anchor, was saying the technologies and services that will get us to net zero by 2050 need to start scaling by 2030, which means that our timing is kind of right with this. So as experienced alumni, how can they help get involved in Carbon 13? Do we need advisors? Do we need mentors?
Yeah, good. Sarah, can you throw up that slide, please? Or Isabel? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I have to say a huge thank you to Cambridge Judge Business School for the vision that they've shown in supporting what we've been trying to do here in Carbon 13. When I went to Christophe, our dean, back in early 2019 and said, I'd like to do this alongside the job as teaching faculty, teaching strategy and entrepreneurship. He was very supportive and said, yes, absolutely. Cambridge faculty are supposed to be doing innovative stuff. Good luck, right? And Carbon 13 is not part of the university. We want a sort of speed of action that perhaps is sometimes difficult when you're in the sort of formal structures of the university. But we feel very much a welcomed part of the ecosystem, and I've had wonderful support from Professor Jochen Runde in particular, and a recent joiner of the faculty, Kamir Mahadis, and all my colleagues in the strategy faculty subject group have been hugely supportive as well. So it's been fantastic. And in fact, both of our other two co-founders who are not here with us, with Nicky and I today, are actually Judge graduates, right? Or actually Judge students who studied entrepreneurship in the postgraduate diploma in entrepreneurship, and as part of that, wanted to be involved in what we're doing here. We strongly welcome help on the mission that we're on. We need access to the talent. I mean, we've got lots of doors that are opening to us in terms of talking to the right scientific and technical people, in terms of talking to the right commercial people, but we can always use more help to get the best 50 people onto our program for March. So if you have doors that you can open with Royal Societies or other places to get us access to get the word out about this program, that's going to be, that's really helpful. We are going to be, well, we have a sort of cadre of mentors from Nicky's experience and my experience in running these types of programs over the years, but we need more mentors. And so we'd very much welcome anyone who's got the sort of energy and enthusiasm to support these entrepreneurs through some of these commercial challenges. And if you want to invest in our startups, then that's something that we can facilitate as well. It bears mentioning. So our email addresses are there, our website is there. We're very happy to continue the conversation beyond this this session. We hope that you've got some value from the discussion. And,
thank you for your questions.
Thank you for your lunchtime and your great questions. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. I think that takes us directly to the actual official stopping point. I guess we've got to hand over to Sarah and Isabel at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you.